Hi, everyone. My name's Dre. I'm a customer success engineer here at MoveWorks, and I'll be our host for today's AI agent workshop. Now, some of the upcoming sessions we've got today, of course, we'll be discussing Slack channel catch-up. Pretty interesting use case that I think you guys will enjoy, just given the ease of setup, really. But then on November 13th next week, we'll do Datadog incident summarization, and then on November 20th, ServiceNow approval and approver notifications. Now, those of you who have maybe seen some of these sessions before might note that we've done a ServiceNow approvals use case in this webinar series before. But this will be a sort of agentified version of that use case. So sort of how would you build that using Plugin Studio? With that in mind, today we're going to again discuss the Slack channel catch-up. We'll have a bit of a conversation about how to build this use case, some of the technology that we're leveraging to get it to work. And then at the end of it, we'll have a Q&A session. So please hold any of your questions until the end. We will certainly get to those in due time. So, what do we mean by Slack channel catch-up? So it's not unusual that when you go out of office or maybe you are just taking the day to yourself that you find that you've sort of fallen behind on some of the updates and maybe an important Slack channel. One of the fun parts about generative AI is its ability to then summarize content. So maybe you've gone to something like ChatGPT and said, summarize this page for me, copy pasted the page in, and it can give you a pretty good summary with at least hitting the high points about what's important of that content. This is actually also true for things like code. So in MoveWorks, of course, we have this capability, but if you go to the bot and ask it to summarize some piece of code, it will tell you sort of at a high level what it does, and you can sort of dig into it more. At the intersection of this would be parsing through the JSON return of a Slack channel history API call. So I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute, and then we'll talk about how we build this into a use case. So broadly, this is the user experience we want to build. Can you catch me up on what's going on in some Slack channel? We need to basically get the channel ID of the channel. Then we need to query the Slack API channel .history, which will give us back the content in that channel. So you can add filtering so you only get back certain kinds of content. Today, we're just going to have it sort of summarize all of the posts that are in my demo Slack channel, but we can talk about that in a bit. So what I did wanted to show though was that sort of functionality that I was talking about. So if I go to the bot and I'm going to go ahead and query, I set up a Slack instance. Here, let's look at that real quick. With a new channel, you can see I just added some miscellaneous posts from our public site. We can go ahead and query using this channel ID of the channel using conversations.history, and we can see the various messages that have been posted to this channel. Now, if we were to copy this content and go to the bot and say something along the lines of, can you summarize this for me? Clearly, a lot of content, sort of not exactly clear how the bot would understand this, but again, it's generative AI, so it's able to sort of parse through this and give you a general sense. So you can already see that it's giving us a sense of the two posts that are from the channel. So pretty cool. But again, how do we make this into a use case? Let me go ahead and clear out this chat. And we will clear the chat even further. And let's go ahead and look at the use case. So really what we need to do is get then that JSON output into the hands of your bot so that way it can then summarize it. So that is actually very simple. Again, maybe you'll see how simple that was just because I just literally just copied and pasted the JSON return from the channel, put that into the bot and asked it to summarize it. You could do this by basically constructing a use case around it. So again, for those of you who are maybe new to Plugin Studio, we need to build a connector to Salesforce, which we've done already, or excuse me, to that's a typo, to Slack, which I've done already to my sandbox instance. So we'll just leverage that connector. We then need to do an action. In this case, our action is going to be the get Slack channel history by channel ID. I'm kind of splitting this up into two use cases I'll show in a moment. And then finally, we have our compound action, which will be the connector plus the action, which then gets paired to a triggering criteria when we build a plugin. And that's sort of how you build this use case. So I think it's fairly straightforward. The terminology might be a little bit weird, but I think you'll get used to it as you see how we build. So let's go ahead and I'm going to exit the slides and we're going to look at the action first. Again, no worries about the connector. I think we mostly know how to build a Slack connector at this point if you've been following along the series. But again, if you do have questions, let's talk about it during the Q&A. Now I've split this use case into really kind of two because I think they're both kind of useful. One is like, what Slack channels do you have access to? And that's what this is going to be. Get all Slack channels. So this is my first action. In this case, I'm literally calling the API conversations.list, and then that's it. I'm just getting back the return from that. This will give you a sense of all of the Slack channels that the bot service account has access to. Let's go ahead and call a test, and then you should be able to see my test Slack channel as well as whatever other out of the box Slack channels Slack will create. So yes, in this case, we have our social channel, and then we have our all new workspace. This is the channel that we're using for our demo. So that's very good. Pretty easy to set up. Again, if you've used Postman or are just familiar with APIs, I think this is very straightforward. Happy to dive into this during the Q&A session if you'd rather. So then the other action that we need is to get channel ID or channel history by channel ID. Again, we're going to use the channel conversations.history API call. We need to pass in as an URL parameter the channel ID. So I'm pulling this directly from Postman. And sort of a fun thing, actually, is if you go into Postman and you click on this little code icon, you can get a curl snippet. Go ahead and copy that. And then you can import curl. So you can just paste that in, click import, and it will set everything up for you. Of course, you'll have to reconfigure auth, but you can also just go to your existing connectors, select the connector, click apply. Now auth is set up, headers are set up. We can clean things up. We have this null key for some reason. We can remove that, but the channel is set up, body, etc. You can go ahead and test this, get back the response. And again, you'll get the sort of same content that we showed in Postman. One thing to call out is that when you do the curl command copy over, you need to make sure that the values that are here, these are not example values. This is actually what will be passed. So you want to replace this with the variable that you want to leverage in your compound action. So in this case, I'm just going to call it channel ID. Then you can input the channel ID here as an example value for your testing on this screen. Once all of this is configured, go ahead and click save it as a new action. And then you're done with actions. You have an action now to get channel IDs or really just all channel details. And then you have another action that is to get conversation history from that channel by channel ID. We'll show you how to string that together. Now, the way I've done this personally is by creating two different use cases. One is to get all Slack channels. This just sort of helps with this being a demo, but you can imagine how you might be able to just build this as a single use case. So you can get all Slack channel conversation history by channel name. Absolutely, that's possible. But for today, I think this is easier to explain around. So the first action we need to do is get all Slack channels. This is the first action we described. And then we just need to return all the Slack channels. So again, this is going to return a JSON object, but the bot will be able to parse through that automatically and understand the context of each of the fields. And so you can then ask questions about it. Or in our case, it'll understand the context that when we say, oh, we want more information about the conversation history for X channel, it'll know that it needs to use the channel ID for that channel. I think it's pretty clever. I think it's cool. So let's go back to compound actions and look at the other side of this, the getting conversation history by channel ID. Oops. Looks like my internet connection might be a little buggy. Okay, so we want to then look at the get Slack channel history by channel ID. In this case, again, we're just going to call the action that we configured earlier. So get Slack channel history by channel ID. We then need to save the output to this Slack channel history output key. This is just the raw JSON of the return. And then we're going to pass that back to the bot. One difference is here we have an input argument, and that input argument is channel ID. Again, we give the bot an example of what a channel ID might look like, and that's going to kind of help it suss out which value from the Slack channel data that we need to pass. Once you have these actions configured, again, in this version of the use case, you'll need to promote both of these as independent plugins. You do by basically clicking the three dots here. If this hasn't already been promoted, you'll be able to select, promote to plugin. Let's see. I think all of these are going to have been submitted already. Uh, but yeah, that's where you'll do it. And once you've done that, it'll show up in your plugins. This is also where you'll modify. So we can look at what a plugin looks like here. So in this case, this is our plugin for getting all Slack channels. You'll note that the use case name is the same as the compound action name. This is so that way it can tie it to it, basically. So we're saying that for this plugin, call the compound action drag get all Slack channels if the triggering criteria fall within the bounds of our trigger definitions here. So these are, you can think of all the questions that you might be able to ask the bot. These are the points that define the boundaries of questions that would be answered by this use case. Sort of a how do I say this? That's like a very hypothetical way to describe this, but I think it does a good job of explaining how this works. You don't have to say specifically what Slack channels are there. You could, but you could also say, can you tell me about the Slack channels you have access to? You can, I mean, really any way that you can phrase that question, the bot should then be able to understand because we've defined some example utterances to trigger on, and it'll be able to understand, okay, it's similar to these, so we need to trigger this use case. You can see some examples of the bot trying to show more information, or more examples. So it's generating these. Can you show me the history of the marketing Slack channel? This is also, you could add this to the should trigger. In this case, I'm not going to. I think it's okay to have this the way it is now. Finally is the drag get Slack channel history by channel ID plugin. Again, we're using the same name as the compound action, and then we're defining trigger criteria. So if you look back at our diagram, we need to call out the compound action. There's only one in a plugin, and then we need to then define trigger criteria. So this is where the triggering criteria is. Once again, just defining the bounds of the kinds of questions that might be asked to trigger this use case. And you can see that you can get a sense here, like, can you give me a summary of the history for the channel and then the channel ID? So I'm constructing this so that way if you know the channel ID for some reason, you can just ask the bot the question like this, can you give me a summary of the channel ID? And then it will be able to know to use that channel ID. Now, the reason I'm doing this is that by calling the first use case, we're going to get that channel ID stored in the context of what the bot knows. And then if we say, oh, we want a summary of that, then it's going to be able to say, okay, I know the channel ID for the channel that they're requesting. I can go ahead and make this call. We're going to slot it in this way. So once we are ready to go, we go ahead and click next and then set up our launch criteria and we are live. So let's take a look at the use case in action. Let's go ahead and just make sure the bot is awake and is responding to me. Say hello, robot. Very good. It's able to respond. So now let's ask, what Slack channels do you have access to? Again, this should pull the Slack channels that it has access to from my demo Slack instance. It's going to take a minute for it to pull the data and then parse through it and understand it. So right now it has just called that, you saw that a second ago, that it called the get Slack channels plugin, and it's going to return the Slack channels that we have access to. So here are the Slack channels, social, all new workspace. And just to show that does make sense, that corresponds to social and all new workspace. Great. So now I might say, can you give me a summary of the posts in the all new workspace channel? So again, the bot now knows what the channel ID is for all new workspace, which you just saw flash on the screen there briefly. So it's going to know to use the channel ID because we've told the bot that this use case needs a channel ID. It doesn't work with a channel name. So it's going to grab that from the context from the prior part of the conversation. It's then going to use that channel ID to submit the API call, and then it's going to summarize it for us. So here we are. Here's a summary of the recent posts in the all new workspace channel. Again, we have a post about enterprise search announcement. We have a post about Moveworks agentic AI. And then we have some channel activity that it's just summarizing, mostly just that I created the channel, I joined it, and then I added a hello world message just to make sure things were working. But I think we can all agree this is a pretty good, quick summary of what's going on in this channel. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and go back to our slides, and we'll go ahead and wrap things up and move to the Q&A section of the call. So before we move to the Q&A, I wanted to share some follow-up resources if you're interested in building this use case and you just need some additional support. The first thing I would highly recommend, especially if you've never built in Creator Studio in general, would be our Creator Studio Developer Certification course. This will walk you through some guided training modules and build some example use cases. And at the end of it, you'll have a multiple choice exam that you can complete to get a LinkedIn certification. So that's kind of nice. You can sort of share your knowledge of Creator Studio, but more importantly, this will be the best resource that you can get to onboard to Creator Studio to really start using Creator Studio. So I highly recommend this resource, even if you don't do the certification. Additionally, we have a documentation and developer community. So documentation portal is going to be your reference material for all things MoveWorks, including Creator Studio. So if you have any questions about functions, features, I've had a lot of questions about like, when will the ingestion be done for this resource? I would recommend starting in our documentation portal. It'll give you all of this information in a pretty easily searchable way. I'm also going to specifically call out our tutorials and guides. This is going to be a list of guides that teach you how to set up new connectors, as well as build some use cases. And this is always expanding. So we have many new resources here, I would guess, from the last time that you were there. Again, I would highly recommend going to this use case guide section. Lots of good information to be found there. Finally, again, is the developer community. This is sort of your forum to ask questions that any other customer of MoveWorks might be able to answer, or people who are internal to MoveWorks as well. So I'm in the community quite a bit myself, but we also have product owners, product managers, engineers, developers, all sorts of personalities in the community who will be able to jump in and answer your questions. And probably have, again, a little bit more experience maybe than more general experience maybe. So we'll say that the community is a good place to tap into the overall general experience of people who interact with MoveWorks. Great resource. That's what I'm trying to say. All right. And with that, we'll move on to the Q&A section. So if you do have any questions, I will unmute you and we can discuss, but please add them to the Q&A and we will get to them. Okay. Looks like we are all out of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close up the webinar room. But thank you all for joining us this week. We hope to catch you next week for the Datadog incident summarization use case, and we will catch you next time. Have a great week.